I'm going to now turn the program over to American Promise President Jeff Clements.
Thank you, Ann. Can you all hear me? I just wanted to say y'all. I'm from Boston, so I'm glad you can hear me. It's so nice to be here in your lovely city with such great weather. I want to thank Ann so much. She has been a super leader. We call our volunteers, and I'm one of them, at American Promise. We refer to us as citizen leaders, and we think every American in a lot of ways is a citizen leader, whether you're running for office or serving in any capacity, which Americans do so much of. And so we're trying to create a space so we can come together and serve our country for, as the title says, a constitutional moment to restore sanity. And I don't know how you feel about that title, whether you're feeling there's some sanity that needs restoring, but many Americans do. And that's what we're going to talk about. How we make our republic a healthy one again. And we think we've got a pretty good idea, but it's not just our idea. We got this, much of what you're going to hear in terms of the constitutional solution we're proposing, from our fellow Americans in rooms all over the country, thanks to the Sumner's Foundation and our other supporters from a project we called Writing the 28th Amendment. We saw it as an opportunity for Americans to engage in town hall settings all over the country. And we think it's there yet, but as you'll note, I mean, we think it's there, but it may not be there yet, and it can be improved. You'll see it in your handout, the actual language where it stands now, but there's also a QR code so you can give feedback and ideas. And we think it's, you know, we've done 27 amendments from the Bill of Rights to one allowing our young Americans, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, to vote. And all of them were in different eras of technology. And we think now we can do QR codes and have input. There's no reason why every American can't be at the table to help shape what this looks like, to get us out of a jam. So let me turn to the jam. My job is to set up sort of all on the same page about what the data shows around the role of money in our political system now, what it's doing to the country, and a bit of background on the amendment, and then bring up my colleagues on the panel to have a conversation about it from their different perspectives, and then, of course, we'll open it up for your questions and comments as well. So I'm going to just run through some slides while they finish their lunch, and then Ann and John and Tom will be up here to join me. So American democracy in crisis. There's a lot of different expressions of that. We can have different views about how we define the crisis and who's to blame and so on. But I think, you know, there's a lot of times where you see two different kind of conversations, a political sort of media conversation with a lot of finger pointing and a lot of division. And then if you look closely, which we have, you actually see another conversation, which is a lot more hopeful, where there's a lot more consensus and a lot more hunger to actually roll up our sleeves and solve it. And we're seeing that here. So most Americans actually agree our republic, our democracy is in crisis. Interestingly, 86% say the number one reason is the role of money in politics. And you don't actually hear that very much with all the division, that we are fundamentally agreed on one big major thing that most Americans think is driving a lot of the dysfunction in different ways and seems out of control. So let's just drill in a little bit, because you know, we see it on our screens, we see it in our press, we see it in our politics, this perception that money from all over the place is pouring in and driving a lot of toxic, divisive kind of attacks and campaigns. And if you think it's grown worse, it sure has. It's essentially doubling in each cycle. Ann Ravel, a former FEC commissioner, federal election commissioner, will join us to update this to 2022. But this is an accelerating problem in terms of billions of dollars. The other thing, And it's from all sources: wealthy donors, super PACs, corporations, unions, and now even foreign entities are interfering in our elections through spending, through the different ways that it can now happen that we cannot control. You have a common thing now in U.S. Senate races, which is essentially the entry fee is $200 million. We had a 2020 race in Maine, near where I'm from, New England, Susan Collins' seat, $200 million, about evenly divided, 100 on each side. And that's a state where there's barely 1 million people. There's not much of a media market. It didn't even make the top 5. $200 million, didn't even make the top 5. So this is a chart of the top 5 most expensive races in 2020 compared to the top 5 Senate races only about a decade ago. Actually, a decade from 2020. So this is the 10 years since a well-known Supreme Court decision struck down the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act and said that we're not allowed to limit outside spending, as it's called, under a theory that that's free speech. So this is what's happened in just one slice of our political life, Senate races. You can barely see what most of us thought was a lot of money in 2010, right? And it's now gone exponentially higher. The other thing it's doing is concentrating. So most of this money is now coming from a smaller and smaller slice of elite donors. Most Americans don't make any contribution. $200 is considered a major contribution. And now you have spenders who are literally writing $100 million checks to super PACs that is then distributed out to races. So it's bipartisan. This is not pointing fingers. This is a systemic problem. This is dark money. That's the money that we don't know where it comes from. It's not disclosed. Nobody knows. And the red is the red and the blue is the blue. And both parties have figured it out, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. Sometimes the Democrats spend more, sometimes the Republicans spend more, but it's now baked into our system that there's billions of dollars flowing in that we don't know where it comes from. Here in Texas, I always try to have a slide for the state. I haven't gone anywhere where I can't make a slide that shows out of control on both sides in your state. So those are some headlines. If you look at them closely, and you have these in front of you too to take home, they're one side or the other. Both sides are spending in very big ways here in Texas. What is the effect of this? It's not just that campaigns cost a lot. It's tearing us apart, and it's a massive way of spending billions of dollars to convince Americans that we really can't trust our system, that somebody else is paying for it, that it doesn't work, that you can't trust any elected official because they're always, you're getting these billions of dollars of stuff at us, and civic trust is collapsing. This is I guess what they call a longitudinal study over decades from Pew, the Pew Research, and the trust in government, those who think you can basically count on the government to try in its honest way to serve the larger interests of the country, versus those who think it is completely controlled by a few small interests. Those who believe the latter are now almost everybody, and those who believe the former, i.e. that government may not always be perfect, but it's trying its best, almost nobody thinks that anymore. It's a collapse in trust in each other, in the outcome of elections, in whether we can count on each other. It's a very concerning thing in a form of government that relies on some level of trust that the system is fair and honest, and we can compete for our different views on that field. Now, I mentioned the Supreme Court. There have been a lot of Supreme Court cases. Ann might, former FEC Commissioner Ravel might take us in a little deeper. But fundamentally, it's a theory. It's a new experiment in American life these last few decades that the First Amendment free speech prohibits us from regulating what's called outside money or independent expenditures, that's a violation of the free speech rights of those who can write those $100 million checks. And so we've lost the ability for that reason to enact laws that could address this better, because those get struck down as violations of the First Amendment. We don't think that's correct. Most Americans don't think that's correct. Many judges and lawyers don't think that's correct. And it's built on a couple of premises that have now been tested for the last decade or so that turn out that they're not true. Ingratiation and access, the court thought, aren't corruption. That means like gratitude for getting those big checks or those campaigns, and extra access that wealthy donors get isn't corruption. Most Americans think that's not true, and I personally think they're right. The appearance of influence and or access will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. The court said even though people might, in the court's view, wrongly think that it's not corrupt to have this spending, even if people thought that, they wouldn't lose faith in our democracy. Well, I go back to that. That was wrong too. People have lost faith. So we have a constitutional problem. We can't just fix this without a constitutional solution. That's why we have the title, A Constitutional Moment to Restore Sanity. And so we just want one last slide on free speech. This is David Trahand, our friend, American Promise supporter, former Republican state senator, head of the largest Second Amendment hunting and fishing group in Maine. Pretty influential. After that $200 million race, he joined our cause. He said it was like being under an avalanche. Nobody could hear us, and we couldn't hear each other. So he felt, and again, he's powerful in a state, that he had and they had no free speech rights, that the money was all coming from outside. They couldn't even buy airtime. It was all bought up by the outside money. Businesses are getting on board. A couple of our business leaders, Pirelli Tire, global public company based in Georgia, the American operation. Dave Black, head of the Harrisburg Chamber, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Chamber, saying, again, this isn't free speech and it's hurting business and innovation. So the constitutional solution, we call it the 4R Freedom Amendment. Again, you have it in front of you. We're not forcing it down anybody. If you have a better way to phrase it, we want to know. But we think it's pretty good. Why a constitutional solution? Well, as I said, we have to do it, but also it has great advantage. We're forced to unite to get it done. We'll need 2/3 of Congress, ratification in 38 states. So like a lot of good big things, when Americans set out to do them, it has a lot of good benefit besides. We get to work together and do something big together, and that's what we're going to need to do here. That's the unity and consensus. It already exists. As I said, somewhere between 75% and 85% want this now. I think the remainder aren't really that hard against it. They just want a little more time to figure it out. That's okay. We got that time. Federalism, it's not a solution that says what Texas has to do versus Massachusetts versus anyone else. It says you have the ability to decide that for yourself. Congress can decide that in federal elections, states in state elections. But what we can't continue to do is do nothing to solve the problem. As I said, I'll just go through these fast so we can get the wonderful panelists up here. Massive support. This is studies we've done in the states. It's a real consensus. There's the language. You have it in front of you. We're going to talk about it now. And so come on up here, Tom, John, and Ann.